Welcome back to the Sports Philosopher's Rant. Today I want to talk about the current state of Star Wars. Give a little bit of a disclaimer and background information here. Obviously, I'm a lifelong Star Wars fan, or I wouldn't even be talking about this subject. My first movie I have any memory of seeing as a child was Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And it was on the old Sony Beta player that we had at my parents' house. I'm kind of showing my age on that one. But anyway, love that movie. It's one of those movies I can watch over and over again. I never get tired of it, no matter how many times I see it. And while I agree with the consensus on the fandom of Star Wars that the best movie of the entire franchise was Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, A New Hope, I think, is always going to be my personal favorite movie to actually watch, even though I can admit that The Empire Strikes Back is the better film. But that being said, we got to talk a little bit about the state of Disney Star Wars. And I've been watching YouTube for years, and I mean, obviously, I just started this channel here recently, and people have said far more eloquently than I can the current state of Disney Star Wars and things like that. I mean, some of the channels that I've been following for a long time, Geeks and Gamers, SC Reviews, Hey Viv, Ethan Van Sciver over there as well. I mean, they've very eloquently stated what a lot of fans have been thinking about Disney Star Wars. And just before I get into Disney Star Wars, though, in general, people like to say, well, people didn't really like the prequels either. I mean, they think that Lucas really lost it with them. And I mean, the prequels had plenty of valid criticism, yes. But when you look at them, the issues with the prequels are largely of execution. We have with the old movies, especially the episodes 4, 5, and 6, Lucas didn't personally direct all three of those. He only actually directed the first one, but he was still there running things, and he was very much the idea guy, and that's always been Lucas's greatest strength, is that he was awesome when it came to creating the storytelling, to creating worlds, and for being the idea guy. Now, his direction has never been considered to be the absolute best, although I will defend forever the way he directed Episode 4. Just, I mean, if you ever want to see a really good documentary on Star Wars, if you've not seen Empire of Dreams, I strongly recommend you to watch it. It's about 3 hours long, so it takes a little bit of time to watch. But wow, it goes behind the scenes and gives you all kinds of looks into how he did some of those things to bring it to you on the big screen, and some of it's just true magic. The way that guy could take the most mundane things and make them look so real. A great example of that is the way he did the surface of the Death Star, how he would line up these long tables, and then he'd go through thousands and thousands of games of the old game Battleship and take those little pieces of the ships out, and he'd line them on these tables, and the cameras would go by there, and that is what makes up the surface of the Death Star. Just one minor example of how he would do with things like that. And a lot of people didn't like that with the prequels because the prequels were so much relying on CGI. So, yes, I understand the criticism there. But largely, I mean, even I've seen fan edits of The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and largely all those edits is just fixing some of the dialogue issues, or especially in The Phantom Menace, it's reducing the role of Jar Jar Binks, things of that nature. But the story itself, people have consistently said, okay, the story is good there. It's just the execution issues. I would say the Disney Star Wars trilogy, and I'm limiting most of these comments just to the trilogy. I'm not talking about every little thing Disney's done with Star Wars. Like, for instance, I think Rogue One they did a pretty good job with, especially considering it wasn't a numbered movie, but it was more of like an expanded universe type of storyline, which is fine. I'm all for some of that. But Disney has several problems going on with the new trilogy. And before I even get fully into that, before I ever even heard that there was an episode 7, 8, and 9 in the works, my thought was always that if they were going to do a sequel trilogy to the original, which ended with Return of the Jedi, obviously, the ideal source material for that they had years ago, and my opinion of that has always been that it should have been the Heir to the Empire trilogy by Timothy Zahn with the books. And if you haven't read them and you're a Star Wars fan, especially a classic Star Wars fan, pick them up now. They are excellent reads. These 3 books would have made a perfect episode 7, 8, 9, not just in comparison to what we ended up getting, but in general, because They followed the events of Return of the Jedi. They didn't retcon anything there. They were very faithful to the lore. The characters were in character. They didn't do any character assassination. They didn't retcon anything. The new characters that were introduced were interesting characters that actually fit into the narrative. It was a great job that they did with that, and I was kind of disappointed when they never pursued those 3 books to be films, because they would have been phenomenal. And if Disney is smart, one thing they might try to do in the future is a TV series, a live-action one, similarly to what they're doing with The Mandalorian, but use some of those as source material. And unfortunately, when they bought out Lucasfilm, one of the first things they did was retcon the entire EU, which I think was a grave mistake. They never should have done that. And while I'm not saying every single story the EU did in the expanded universe was good, but there was a lot of good stuff there, and a lot of really good authors were working on the material there. And yes, they probably needed to do a little bit more work on streamlining it to where there's more consistency with it. And I get that, but at the same time, there was some incredible stories there. With Disney Star Wars, I think the biggest problems is the things that made the Heir to the Empire books work so well. The exact opposite was done with these movies. Now, when The Force Awakens came out, my initial reaction to that was, this is a pretty good movie. It feels like Star Wars, and they were going for a very safe approach in this movie. They were trying to basically say the fans weren't very... They weren't real big on the prequel movies, so let's try to get back to what Lucas did in his original 3 movies. And you could see that in it very clearly, that The Force Awakens in many ways is a carbon copy, like a poor man's A New Hope, is basically what it is. But if that's all it was, I mean, I would understand the point of it and agree that it was good. But the movie, in my opinion, doesn't age all that well. And part of the biggest reason for that is because of the virtual retcon they do with Return of the Jedi. And while they don't completely retcon it outright, what they do is they invalidate the victory of it. As soon as the movie begins, we immediately see that this new entity called the First Order, just out of nowhere, has basically replaced the Empire with no explanation as far as where they come from, who they are, what their goals are, or anything other than just basically being a big totalitarian regime that just kind of comes out of nowhere. And it doesn't really work all that well because in the establishment of the story that we've already had following Return of the Jedi, there needs to be more explanation as to where this group came from and things of that nature. But even then, I'm still willing to give that they made a good effort to make a Star Wars movie here, even though I think that there were some issues there, especially with how they treated the victory of Return of the Jedi. But then Episode 8 happened, and this is the moment that I really feel like the entire Star Wars fandom was just utterly broken. I have never walked out of a Star Wars movie before this one just thinking, what in the world did I just watch? That was my initial reaction. I saw that movie twice in theaters only because I bought 2 tickets before it was released. Bought one for the premiere night, and I bought one for the next morning so I could see it again. So I thought, after seeing it initially, I'm like, I don't know if I really want to watch this movie again, quite frankly. But I thought, okay, maybe if I sleep on it, maybe my thoughts will be more clear. Maybe it was a bad dream or something. I go into watching it the second time. I see it. I realize, no, it's even worse the second time. And I have never watched the film since. And it's been over 2 years since it came out. So do with that what you will. But anyway, this movie, in my opinion, is basically just Rian Johnson giving the finger to the Star Wars fans. There is nothing in this movie that feels Star Wars at all. It butchers the characters. The story makes absolutely no sense. It does not accomplish anything. And even bigger than that, it blows up everything that was set up in The Force Awakens. I understand if you're going for surprises and things like that, and you want to have a movie that has a lot of twists in it. I get that completely. M. Night Shyamalan has made a career making movies like that. That's all he does. But it's a very different process when you do that in the second part of a 3-act story. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. The parts of the first one are supposed to be further developed in the second one. It's not supposed to be blown up, literally. I mean, And then the parts that actually were in the movie don't really serve any purpose. You get that extremely long and boring scene at Canto Bight. You have new characters that have no connection whatsoever to anybody, that do not function well at all, like Vice Admiral Hodo, which all they had to do if they wanted to have a person play that kind of role is do Akbar, who you already have, and you just write him off for no reason. Very popular character with the fans. And then Rose Tico. Nothing against the actress. She was very charming and everything, but I don't understand what they were going through with her characters or her arcs even more. And they also took Finn, who worked out really well, I thought, in The Force Awakens and was set up to be an important character, and they completely sidelined him on an unimportant quest. And I mean, I could go on and on about my complaints with The Last Jedi, and oh my goodness, how they don't have Luke. They don't have time to have Luke grieve for Han, but they have time for him to drink the alien milk, which makes absolutely no sense in the world to me. And not even that. This isn't even getting into all the problems with what they did to Luke Skywalker himself, or the bigger issues of the lore with the Force and how these Force ghosts can all of a sudden summon Force lightning and interact with the physical world. I mean, if that was the case, why don't they just turn all the Jedi into an army of Force ghosts and then just go annihilate all the big bad guys? That's what I would do. But this movie ends in a way that basically blows up every single possible plot line for Episode 9. And that made it the worst Star Wars movie I have ever seen in my life, because it not only is a bad movie, but it destroys the entire trilogy, because everything's set up in The Force Awakens. What's the point of going and watching that movie again? I mean, you now see that what follows it is absolute chaos. And of course, the Rise of Skywalker comes out, and you could very clearly see that J.J. Abrams, for all his faults, was at least trying to get the fans back in this movie. You could see that, because he's giving a lot of shout-outs and Easter eggs to hardcore Star Wars fans in there. He brings back Palpatine, which I understand why he did it. He did it out of desperation, but I say for many reasons that was the wrong move. And he also, many times, basically just cuts Rian Johnson a new one and just overtly attacks him and bashes him and tries to retcon his stuff. But unfortunately, I just think all of this kind of falls flat in this film, and I really don't think that there was that much that J.J. Abrams could have done to save it. If you want my honest opinion of what he could have done to make this film better, there are two real things that I think would have given it basically the best ending he possibly could have given it. One would have been to bring back Snoke as Darth Plagueis, the master of Palpatine. And the reason for that, they could have done the exact same thing that Luke did, basically, and make him a Force projection when he was killed, and then he can easily explain that as being the way that he survived. But if you have Plagueis in there rather than Palpatine, it doesn't retcon the end of Return of the Jedi and completely throw Anakin Skywalker's sacrifice out the window, which really was infuriating to watch. But it also would tie the entire series together, being that Plagueis was before Palpatine. He was there, and he was clearly mentioned. It would reference the prequels, the original trilogy, in his mentoring of Palpatine, and basically being the invisible man behind the Empire that's never seen. And also it comes full circle here in Episode 9. I think that would have worked out really well. The other thing that they needed to do is have Kylo Ren and Rey take him out together. This whole Rey being this super overpowered character who's had virtually no training at all, and just explaining it away as her basically inheriting the powers of all the Jedi, it doesn't work. It does not work. And again, there are other issues in this movie too. Again, with the issues with the lore, especially this Force Ghost stuff is just ridiculous. How they can suddenly interact with the physical world, and how Luke is able to bring the ship out of the water as a Force Ghost. If he could do that, why that just makes him look even worse in The Last Jedi. And there are other minor nitpicky things that around there. But bottom line is, in my opinion, The Last Jedi was the thing that really blew this entire thing up. And this goes beyond just Rian Johnson. Is how was this allowed to even happen in the first place? I mean, Kathleen Kennedy, the president of Lucasfilm, deserves every bit of blame for not making sure that there was an actual plan that they all had to follow, because it's very obvious when you watch these three movies that they are extremely disjointed. They're not telling a coherent story from start to finish. The second act looks like it was in another franchise and not in Star Wars at all. It looked like the only thing it was trying to do was just derail the roller coaster. So I would definitely say the absolute biggest problem here is that they didn't have a plan. But I also think The Last Jedi was another problem. And then the disrespect to the lore and all of that. And I respect the people who worked really hard to make these movies. I get that they worked hard, especially the actors and actresses. They did the best they could with what they were given to deal with. The people in charge of all of this, though, really need to not be put in charge of a franchise again, at least not all working separately. But I think if Abrams had done it himself, I mean, say what you want about him, you definitely would have had a better episode 8. And I think the entire storyline would have played out a lot better. Not that I'm the biggest fan ever of his work, but he would have at least had some sort of coherence in there that works and not the mess that we ended up getting. But that being said, I'm not a hater of all things that Disney's done. Like I said, I think Rogue One is a pretty good movie. Also, The Mandalorian is coming along really nicely. I just think that they need to have the people who are in charge of The Mandalorian, Jon Favreau, and especially Dave Filoni. These are the guys that they need to put in charge of Star Wars. Not because they're men or anything like that and we can't handle women, but because these guys understand what Star Wars is all about. Favreau has long been a good movie maker, and Filoni has been quite possibly the spiritual successor to George Lucas, really. Lucas himself said that Filoni's the closest thing he has to a son when it comes to this whole Star Wars saga and all of that. And he clearly understands it. His work with Clone Wars was phenomenal. So I'm really glad to see him in charge of him and Favreau together in charge of The Mandalorian. And I think if Lucasfilm goes in the direction, which I'm hoping they will, which is to make Jon Favreau the president of Lucasfilm, and then make Dave Filoni the head of the creative team, that they really have the potential to get this ship going in the right direction and to turn it around. Unfortunately, the Disney trilogy 7, 8, and 9 just does not work, and it's not going to age well at all. But that being said, if they go in the right direction with these guys as the future of Star Wars, they really could have a really good thing going. Anyway, that's my opinion. Leave your comments below, and if you agree, great. If you disagree, that's fine too. I'm always up for discussion on things of that nature. But you all have a great weekend, and I will talk to you next time.